All right. My name is Ben Werman. Thank you for coming to my podcast. I am so excited today to bring on Stephan Livera, one of my personal favorites to listen to. He has a podcast called the Stephan Livera Podcast. It covers Bitcoin, Austrian economics, libertarianism, basically all the most important topics happening in the world right now, I would say. And I really appreciate you for coming on, man. Thank you for taking the time.
No worries. Thank you for inviting me, Ben.
So, the reason why I brought you on today is because we are approaching an election year. Every 4 years, humans all get together around their talking box and they get mad at each other about politics. And I wanted to bring you here because you are one of the people that personally libertarian pilled me. I grew up very far on the left side of the spectrum. I think that that's almost sort of what people are just born into in certain parts of the world. I come from a very blue state. Other people have the exact same thing happen on the right side. They're born in the South. They're sort of just born into this feeling that Democrats are bad. I was born into this feeling Republicans are bad. And it really just becomes this growing tribalism between these two parties. And certain policies are here, certain policies are there, but you would disagree and say that this is the wrong way that people are thinking about this entire thing in general. And I know you would consider yourself a libertarian. So let's say you walk into an elevator, you got a Democrat and a Republican in there. They're covered in scrapes and bruises because they've been beating the shit out of each other. You have until you get to the top floor to pitch them on why they're thinking about this wrong. What would you say?
The short answer is you can both have what you want so long as you are willing to give each other a certain level of freedom. And that's why libertarianism is different. So historically, some libertarians have, I guess that's kind of the elevator pitch, really. And now we're getting into the explanation because in reality, you can't sell these ideas in 30 seconds, right? In the elevator time. But the short version of it is that if you are a more right-leaning person and you're into guns and maybe maybe you're anti-drugs as an example, but maybe that person on the left is more into, maybe they're anti-guns and they're pro-drugs. I mean, I'm just obviously taking hypothetical or typical examples. We don't have to have this one world government that everybody lives under the same rules. We could actually live in a place or in different places where they actually have different rules. And so some of this is getting to this idea of like federalism, this idea that you could have different rules across different states, which is theoretically, that's the idea of America, of the United States of America. Now, the broader idea that I see is, I mean, we can go to the kind of basic principle of the NAP, the non-aggression principle, which, people may have heard of, may not have heard of, but the point I would get to is by creating this state, this territorial monopolist of law and order and taxation, you create this need for each side, per se, to go and take control of that so that they can try to either hit the other side with it or at least try to defend themselves from the other side. What if we took away that apparatus? What if we could devolve that power down from the federal to the state? And even at the state level, are there things that can be devolved down to the county level? And from that county level, could we devolve things down to the family level? And so I think that's the high level way many libertarians are thinking about this. Now, of course, libertarianism, there's a broad church of different views. There are some libertarians in the camp of maybe just make the government a little bit smaller. And then you've got other libertarians who you would call a minarchist libertarian, a person who believes that maybe the state should only do law and maybe national defense and, just a few very basic functions. And then the most, in my view, principled view is the anarcho-capitalist view of libertarianism, which is that everything should just be a fully free market. In 2 words, it's privatize everything. Private courts, private law, private roads, private everything. But I mean, that's sort of the high level idea. But I think to the broader question of what do we do about this quote unquote national divorce idea that is becoming more popularized in American political discourse nowadays. And
Yeah.
I think it would be a good step. So my friend Jeff Deist, he was previously president of the Mises Institute. He was now he is over at Monetary Metals as general counsel. But he has a really great talk where he talks about this idea of smaller is better. And so think about it this way. How much sense does it make that, there's a couple hundred congressmen and senators in America, in the USA, who make rules for 330 million Americans, or 350 million, something, I don't know exactly, but in that range.
I think it's like 330 million or something.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's absolutely crazy to think that this group of people over in DC, in the swamp, can set the rules that are appropriate for everybody else. And to give people an analogy, imagine you're living in a town and you can see the mayor, and the mayor, maybe his kids go to the same school with your kids, or, you see him at the coffee shop or at the butcher or whatever. There's more social pressure that could be brought to that person in that local township area that would be pro-socializing. I think one of the problems that we see with the state today is it is anti-socializing. It becomes more, whether that is having a large welfare state or a large warfare state, you end up with these big institutions that don't treat people like people. They dehumanize people. And so then you end up with all these people who are dependent on welfare, as an example, or maybe they need food stamps, and the system, no matter how much money they just keep throwing at it, they're doing it the wrong way. And so they are not creating good outcomes. They are just creating more poor people. They are not actually lifting them up out of poverty in a system that promotes free markets and prosperity. And on the other hand, of course, you've got the warfare state. So, as I don't need to explain this, but all around the world, America, the USA, has gone around doing bombing, drone bombing, surveillance, you name it. Many, many wars and forever wars. So in recent years, Iraq and Afghanistan were these something like 20-year wars with massive failure, massive death, and just basically no success per se to show for it. So
The forever
I think,
wars.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are just fundamentally in this world. And then, so of course, now I'm an Australian living in Dubai. Why do I care even about what's happening in America? But I think part of that is because America's cultural and economic dominance for so many years has influenced all over the world. And because of the American monetary system with the Federal Reserve and fractional reserve banking, we are in some ways all beholden to the American monetary regime, whether you are an American or you are not. And so that's why I think it's important to advocate for liberty and to explain why it's something different. So whether you are a personally left-leaning or personally right-leaning from a cultural perspective person, you can still support liberty, which is this notion. Now, to be clear, it's not the same as libertinism, right? So some people get that a little bit confused, because if you are a libertine individual, that may mean a preference for hedonistic activity, maybe, associated with things like doing drugs or very, just kind of pleasure in the moment. And that's not the same thing as libertarianism. So libertarianism is more specifically about this idea of the NAP, the non-aggression principle. So I think those are a few broad ideas. I'll let you, direct the conversation further.
Yeah, and in terms of the NAP principle, I guess a good analogy that some people get is your rights end where your fist stops and my face begins. Like, do what you want to do as long as it doesn't hurt me or my family.
Yeah, that's the broad idea. I mean, maybe you could make an argument about, like, okay, if let's say somebody threatens to punch you and they're in the act of punching you, it's not that you have to let them hit you before you're allowed to retaliate, right? Like, you're allowed to defend yourself. Like, but the general idea and the general concept here is you own your body, or you control your own body, and so therefore you are the owner of it, and you should have the ultimate right to decide whatever happens with that. And also, in order for us to live on this earth, goods are scarce. Land is scarce, as in you and I both can't stand on the same land at the same time. There needs to be ways in which we can actually operate. And so if you were to operate in, let's say, a communist paradigm or a paradigm where there was no land, we would all have to stop and ask permission before we did anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Oh, am I allowed to walk here? Oh, yeah. Am I allowed to do that? Oh, no. Because somebody, well, there's a better way. We could have a system of
Mm-hmm.
private property. We could say, well, actually, Ben owns this particular piece of land and Stefan owns this other piece of land. They are allowed to choose to do what with that land as they choose. And then there's this other idea of obviously not stealing from each other, not hurting each other. You know, if I were to damage your house or your property, you know, then you have some kind of recourse to get restitution out of me, as an example. So I'm just spelling out some of the rough contours of the philosophy. Of course, in practice, that will be different. There'll be different ways that applies. There may be some private agencies that help you defend your property, or private courts that help you determine what is the correct outcome in this particular case, whether it's a dispute about land rights or property or contracts, these different aspects of it. But that's the high level idea. It's the high level idea is that you and I should be able to own ourselves and own things, and then make agreements where I agree to, let's say, do a service for you in exchange for Bitcoin or whatever, or I sell you this apple or this steak for Bitcoin. Like, that's an example, but that's the general idea, that we should really respect private property rights, and not just in a merely mouthed way where we sort of say we respect private property rights. No, like, we take private property rights very seriously, and that it should not be something that a government can just easily impinge on that and say, even though, Stefan, you theoretically have this property right in your own body, you're actually not allowed to work for Ben for less than $15 an hour, right? Because that is an impingement on my rights. And so that would be a libertarian approach to society, which is the non-aggression principle, which basically spells out, when you apply that idea, it means you can't hurt other people, you can't steal their stuff, you can't misrepresent. So, for example, I can't do fraud against you and tell you I'm going to do something and not actually deliver with that because you paid me and I didn't deliver for you. That should still be illegal, right? In a sense, I've stolen from you. So that's kind of the high level of it. And when you see it that way, it means private property owners are the people who should decide what happens on their property. So here's a few things that may be a little bit counterintuitive. As an example, libertarians don't necessarily believe in freedom of speech per se. What they believe in is private property, and the owner should set the rules, right? So if I visit your home and I'm on your property, I have to obey your rules. It's your property. And so I think sometimes this concept of freedom of speech can be a little bit of a misconception, because if I try to assert a certain right to freedom of speech, even while standing on your property in your house, well, who's going to win? There has to be a way of resolving that particular conflict. And the way libertarians resolve these conflicts is by focusing on the private property rights and who is the owner of that land, who is the owner of that particular item, whether it's a server, right? If you're running a server and you have a forum, well, you're the one who's running that forum, so you should decide. So that's fundamentally where libertarians are looking at things a little bit differently from a typical person who is either coming from the Democrats or the Republican Party, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you start to think of everything through that private property lens, like all the way down to your body. Like, this is the most private property that you should have. Is like, I can do what I want with my body. It's my life. It's my health. Like, every human being should be born into the world with the right to do what they want to do, live the life they want to live. And this has also been part of my journey through this political spectrum of kind of just seeing both sides as fighting over which things they should have the right to infringe on other people. And pretty much every policy that you look at can be boiled down to that. The biggest one of all being the monetary regime that you mentioned, which is stealing from everybody all the time as sort of a baseline. So I feel like that would be a good one to jump into now. What is this monetary regime? And I've spoken about it before here as the Federal Reserve. It's a very large topic, but how would you explain that as the ultimate uh, destroyer of private property?
Yeah, for sure. So we live in an age where we don't actually have free choice in our money. So the state will have legal tender laws and it will have various interventions into the market for money and banking. That pushes us towards using certain things as money, typically the chosen fiat currency of that government. So wherever you live, that's typically the mandated currency. And they have various ways of trying to keep you in that system. So for example, capital gains tax laws. So if we were to try to use other things as money, they would say, well, at every point you transition it, the capital gains tax, pay up. And so that obviously makes it very difficult to use alternative forms of money. But it gets worse than this, because in order to use money, typically people are using some form of banking system. Now, of course, in Bitcoin, we talk about being your own bank, but in the fiat system, if you want to transfer money long distances or internationally, you are using the fiat banking rails in some way. So whether you're using PayPal or Venmo or Cash App or instructing your bank with a wire, going to Chase Bank or whatever bank and doing a wire from my account to yours, you are relying on that centralized system. But here's the problem with that centralized system. It's not just a totally free market system where the money is sound in the sense that it was chosen by the individuals. Really what happened is there was this big history to it, that historically people were using other monies, such as gold and silver, historically, and then governments would manipulate and get their hands into those systems. Then over time, they would create central banks, and those central banks would be used to typically be a lender of last resort for individual banks who had gone out of business. So fundamentally, what happens is banks will get bailed out when they should have been allowed to go under. They should have been allowed to go bust. And fundamentally, this is all of this is happening in a system where they are just printing more of it. They're creating more of it. Now, in a fractional reserve system, the way new money is created is when those banks lend out money, and they're doing that beyond what they have in their reserves, per se. So just a quick example. Let's say you had a bank with 100 gold ounces in your vault, and you issued out 100 paper tickets. Each of those tickets is sort of redeemable for an ounce of gold. Now imagine in the community, people go around and instead of actually getting the gold and getting it from the vault and giving it to each other, they say, oh, well, I've got a paper ticket and it's good for 1 ounce of gold in Ben's vault over at his bank. I'm just simplifying a little bit, but the idea is, imagine if we were to just circulate those tickets around like they were money. Now, let's say you were a dishonest banker and you actually started issuing more paper tickets than actual gold ounces that you had back in your vault, right? So as an example, let's say you issued 150 tickets, but you only had 100 ounces of gold in your vault. Now you can start to see what's happening here, because you are creating more paper claims to money than there is actual money. And so this would be a really great way for you to obviously enrich yourself. Now, the normal
Great
free
sales
market
pitch too. Come here, we got more tickets.
well, and I mean, it could, and in practice, the way it might have happened is you might be giving out loans and collecting interest on that, right? Because whereas if you had restrained yourself to only 100 tickets, well, you can't earn as much interest, right? Now, the free market check against this kind of thing is if there's a run on the bank. So let's say a lot of people start to come to your bank and try to redeem those tickets for the actual gold ounces. Obviously, there's only 100 ounces in the vault. So once you get to, 100 tickets redeemed, you've got nothing left. So at that point, what do? Well, you either have to just, go out of business, or maybe you can find a way to sort of stave the customers off and say, oh, no, the ATMs are closed. Or, oh, no, the bank's closed. We can't pay you out.
It's a holiday, bank holiday.
right? And so
Yep.
you can sort of, I'm spelling out in a very kind of simple example, but you can sort of analogize a little bit. Obviously, I'm being a bit loose about some of the details, but the point is, it would make sense for these bankers to sort of get together and say, hey, we can't have all these banking crises. We need a central bank to lend to us, to give us liquidity when we are about to go under. And and of course, they will sell all kinds of stories and messages about why they need to do this to retain the stability of the banking system, to retain the trust and the confidence in the dollar, or they'll have some kind of flowery rhetoric about it. And this kind of reasoning is what led to the creation of the Federal Reserve, which enables this kind of system. Now, why is this system bad? Because here's the thing. It's good for some people. It's good for the people who are getting that new money first. So this is a point that comes from Austrian economics. It's people refer to it as the Cantillon Effect, although it's a specific form of the Cantillon Effect. But put it this way: imagine that when that new money gets created, it doesn't just automatically drop the prices everywhere all at once. It takes time for that price effect to get filtered out into the economy, and it matters who gets that new money first. So think of it this way: money is not neutral. It matters who gets that money first. So either you as the banker, or let's say you gave a loan to me, expanding beyond the amount of gold you had in your vault, then I'm benefiting as well, because I'm getting to spend that money before that's actually reflected in the purchasing power of those paper tickets that we have.
And the prices rise from the inflation.
Right. And so
Mm-hmm.
there are winners and losers in a fiat inflationary system. So put it this way: if you are a saver, if you're the kind of person who saves money, you will obviously lose in that system because your money is getting devalued, right? In your bank account, you might still have 10,000 US dollars as an example, but what it buys you is a lot less, because now a car costs you $50,000 instead of $10,000 like it did a few years ago or whatever. So you can sort of see how this system punishes some people and it rewards others. So it rewards those people who take out debt, and the real terms of that debt goes down. So what does that mean? It means the actual purchasing power amount that you have to pay back your loan is going down over time because of the overall inflationary system that we are operating in, as in there's more and more new money being created over time. And so it benefits those people who know how to play the fiat debt games. And when you apply that at a system and society and cultural level, it encourages certain kinds of behaviors. For example, house flipping, or this kind of Airbnb arbitrage,
Yes.
or various kinds of things which you're seeing and hearing, right? We're seeing and hearing these kinds of things. You see these articles about, oh, look at this 25-year-old guy who started buying property at 18 and now he's got 30 properties because he just leave it up, and took on more and more debt. Now, maybe somewhere along the way there's mortgage fraud involved, or various shady practices in order to get that kind of debt. But that's how some of these people are doing it, and then they basically see it like, hey, this is how you play the fiat game. You play these leverage games. But what Bitcoiners are talking about is actually replacing that with a different system that is actually just and fair in that sense. I mean, fairness is a tough word to use, but let's say it's more just. It's about justice is maybe a more precise way to frame it, which is that we could have a monetary system where there is a set cap and you can't go beyond that. And importantly, there's no central bank that can bail out bad Bitcoin banks, because there are no bailouts in Bitcoin. And so, to be clear,
Yeah.
I mean, no government bailouts, right? It's possible that a private entity could say, okay, I'm going to try to bail out this entity with
But
funding.
they would have to pay the price for that. Like, they would be taking a risk.
Exactly.
And the current central bank doesn't take any risk. It just presses a few keys on a keyboard
They
and
can
then
press the button
it's
and
done.
print new money into existence. And depending on where you are in the world, there are cases where most of the new money comes from lending, which is in most cases in the Western world. But in certain cases, like in Zimbabwe or some of these other countries, it actually does become just straight up central bank is printing or government treasury is printing, because they are perhaps more advanced in the inflationary stage. And when you get to that late stage, it sort of goes from just lending as being the vector for money creation versus straight up printing. But it gets really weird in those scenarios because people don't want to hold that fiat currency, right? If you're in Zimbabwe or if you're in Argentina, you treat the money like it's a hot potato, right? It's monetary hot
Yeah.
potatoes. As soon as you earn that money, you need to run out and spend it and buy something to preserve your purchasing power, because otherwise, even in a few days, your purchasing power is rapidly being diminished. So that's the importance of Bitcoin, because it brings back this ability to have a just monetary system.
Yeah, and people see these things going on in the world. They know that they're happening, that hyperinflation is happening, and that example you gave where people, like, the second they get the money, they're running to the store, and there's certain these stores have to have these weird hours set up because they just know they're going to get rushed during payday. Um, this is happening everywhere, and people think that it's just not going to happen in their country because they may have a government. And, like, for me, for example, like, I'm surrounded by Americans here in America who just never think about these things because we just think we're better than everyone else for some reason. And when really every single fiat currency is on that same track, because
Yeah.
when you put the God button in anyone's hands of being able to just give free money and power anywhere, human nature is just going to do its thing, and it's just going to keep going up and up and up. And people who are more sociopathic are going to find their way into those positions to be able to have that power of God and be able to bestow this infinite money printer wherever they want. And we're all going, every single fiat currency is going that direction. And one of the things that you also mentioned that I think is interesting is just this idea that the idea of banks originally were a good service. Like, it's having a custodian for your money. It was pretty cool when it's gold, it's bulky, and it's easier to move paper notes around, but it's just, it failed because it was very gameable. And one of the things that I liked from the Bitcoin standard was kind of, when I read the book, The Bitcoin Standard, Safety talked about how banks in itself, it's a good idea, but not when there's an infinite money printer at the top, that Federal Reserve, they can just bail out everything all the time. And as you mentioned, if there is an actual free market there where a failure actually leads to a cleansing, and people just think that the idea of a failure is just bad, but it's a good thing because all the people that work there will go to the stronger businesses. It will teach a lesson to the market to not fuck around that hard and to be smarter and to use better rules. And by replacing that central bank at the top that really just ruins it, and instead having a Bitcoin standard where there are actual immutable rules that no one can change, it could potentially make banks work well again because they would be stuck on the system. Now, I know you also mentioned, of course, that we talk about being our own bank. And how do you juggle those two ideas? Whether do you think that being our own bank is what everyone should be doing and we should just be all in on that and there will never be commercial banks again? Or do you think that Bitcoin could fix the commercial banks and they could actually work better in the future under a Bitcoin standard?
So where we are today is that Bitcoin is extremely early. There's an opportunity there because it is so early. We are probably about 100 million people around the world who actually hold some Bitcoin. And to be clear, that includes people who are holding some on an exchange somewhere. In terms of self-custodial Bitcoin users, it's probably under 10 million. So there are definitely opportunities there because I believe the world is coming to Bitcoin. And so it's massive in that sense. But to answer your question, you can be your own bank today. I think many people can be their own bank today. But in the longer term, it really depends on where the technology goes and how feasible it is for people to actually be a self-custodial user. Maybe some of that is kind of technical stuff. We won't get too into the details of it. But I think maybe in the future, we may have, instead of 40,000 banks that exist today with basically one Federal Reserve kind of at the top of it all. Yes, there are central banks in the other countries, but it's we're all sort of being driven a little bit by the Federal Reserve. We could live in a future where there's tens of millions of Bitcoin banks, and some of those people can be individuals who just control their own coins, and others could be individuals who are doing it on behalf of their family. Some of them may be for-profit businesses and banks. Some of them may be community bank style. There's all kinds of opportunities there. But of course, if you're into this early, if you're accumulating Bitcoin and you're DCAing and you're using, the auto stacking plans and stuff like this that we have at swan.com, These are some of the ways that you can be one of those people who is a banker in that sense. But it'll be a banker in a sense that you are in a system where there's no central bank. And that's the whole point. It's a decentralized alternative to fiat currency and central banking. So we would have a banking system, a Bitcoin banking system, and that is what enables so much more freedom, because the whole thing is a full reserve context, meaning it's very hard for that banker to go fractional, because once he does, he risks a bank run. And once the bank runs happen, which they will, they're a natural free market check against bad behavior. That guy is going to go out of business if he does dishonest banking. So I think that's part of the vision for the future that I see. Of course, I want as many people to be able to be their own bank as possible, but I also understand it's also not technically feasible today that all 8 billion people can control their own Bitcoin. I mean, we don't have to get into the technical weeds about it, but that's sort of how I see it. So, there's this saying in Bitcoin where we say, not your keys, not your coins. And so that's an important mantra, idea, concept, or rule. I even say that's rule 1 of Bitcoin. Just focus on that. So basically, the way we encourage people at swan.com is that you can buy Bitcoin and automatically withdraw it to your own wallet. And it's easy. You can get like a wallet on your phone, and basically you have a Bitcoin address and you withdraw to that Bitcoin address. And now you hold the coins. You don't leave them in somebody else's vault. You put them out, you take them out into your particular storage system.
Excellent. Awesome stuff. I'm glad we got to infuse Bitcoin in there and talk about how that fixes the banking problem. I would like to now sort of bring it back to where we started, just going sort of more
Sure.
general government terms. So I think that from all that, people should be understanding the government has too much power right now. It has this infinite money printer that I would consider the most powerful tool it has. And that's why Bitcoiners are so focused on that right now, is the Death Star, as Mark Moss puts it. I think that some people are still scared of this idea of completely stripping the government dry, because they're getting these services that appear to be helping them, or maybe are helping them in many cases. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Things like police, firefighters, having roads. That's kind of one of the major memes, is who will build the roads if we don't have the government. What is your argument for that, and why we don't need the government to be doing every one of these things?
So it comes back to that same idea that if you trust that the government doesn't have to create the food for you to eat, you can also think of that same idea applied in other places. I don't need the government to create the computer for me to use, or the mobile phone for me to use, or other things. Why wouldn't it also be true that in a competitive free market, there will be manufacturers and companies who will make these things more efficiently than I could? And I just apply that consistently in all places, whether that is healthcare, whether that is food, whether that is technology, whether that is travel, accommodation, housing, clothing, textiles, all of these things. So I'm just applying that idea more consistently. Now, what we typically see is people will say, oh, but I'm benefiting from this particular thing. But here's the thing you've got to consider. You have to think about what the world would have been like if the government didn't regulate that or produce it. Because sometimes when the government commandeers resources from the private sector to create a particular department, those resources could have otherwise been spent by the private sector, by the voluntary private market, to produce things. And it's difficult because we're looking at it's counterfactuals. It's like understanding, well, I came to this path and there was a fork in the road and I went down pathway 1. But what if I didn't go down pathway 1? What if I went down pathway 2? So in this case, in basically every case, I think there would be private market entrepreneurs who would have built the roads if the government didn't. And the interesting thing to point out is that people grow up in the world and just think it should just stay the way it is. But remember, it wasn't always this way. There were private people making the roads before. The United States, I think, didn't even have an income tax until like 1912 or something like this. So there are other ways to fund these things. And of course, we can get into the details about specific examples about how would the roads be made privately. But remember, the roads even now are made privately. It's just that the government pays a private company, or there's some kind of
They're just the
public-private partnership.
middleman. There are no
Right,
government officials going out like paving the sidewalk.
right. So you can just
They
cut the middleman out and
they're just the
pay
winner
the
picker.
private man directly. And put it this way,
Mhm.
there are all kinds of business models for this. So as an example, you might be a businessman who has a shop, and you might say, well, I want a way for customers to come find me. I'll pay for the road. And so it's kind of like that, in economic terms, that businessman is internalizing the externality. And so he's built the road, and now, okay, well, customers can use that road, so now there's a road. There are other ways to do this. Maybe it could be even communal in a way, right? And you might think, oh, what? Like capitalists talking about communal things? Like, isn't that the opposite? No. People can voluntarily agree, hey, in this particular neighborhood or this particular street, we're all going to come together and chip in some money to maintain the road. In a similar way that apartment owners might have a strata complex or a homeowners complex where they pay for the joint amenities for the building, whether if they have roofing and electricity and other aspects of plumbing work that needs to be done at a group level, well, then they might chip in a group way. So the point is, it doesn't have to be done by the state. And when I say the state, I'm not talking about like New York and California and Texas. I mean the state, meaning the territorial monopolist of violence, of order, of law and order, of taxation. That's kind of the state. You can have government in private forms, right? You could even argue that a family is a form of government in a way, or governance maybe. That you can have, the parents who are making the decisions for the children. That is a form of government in a way, private government to be clear, but governance nonetheless. And so the point here is more just about not having a monopolist who gets to decide all the rules and who gets to do the classic, if you've seen Star Wars, the classic Darth Vader line where he says, "Pray I do not alter the deal any further." Right? That's
Yes.
basically the situation most of us are in with the state, because the state can just say, hey, taxes are going up 10%, and if you don't like it, stiff, too bad. So that's the relationship many people have with the state. But the challenge is that many people believe this is correct, this is right, that it's good and just for this arrangement to continue. So, but the good news is there are more people realizing, wait a second, I've seen a lot of human rights abuse over the last few years, and it was actually done by many of these states around the world, as in the state. So that is causing the scales to fall from their eyes in many cases. But of course, there are a lot of people who are having Stockholm syndrome or Melbourne syndrome, I might add. But fundamentally, most people will just go with the herd. But if you, or for listeners, if you see yourself like a more open-minded person who is willing to think critically and maybe challenge what the prevailing narrative is and focus on what's actually correct as opposed to just doing things because I want to fit in with the tribe, then maybe that you have an opportunity here to free yourself from a kind of mental burden in a way and take on a more libertarian style of thinking and Bitcoiner style of thinking, which is to actually question and critically analyze things as opposed to just accepting things because that's what everybody else does. I think this is actually an important point. So let me just expand a little bit here. I think we live in a world where fundamentally most people don't really care that much about what's right or wrong. They really care more about fitting in with their tribe. And particularly, they focus on who is high status within that tribe. And so in many cases, the president of the United States is a high status person, etc. So in that paradigm, they look at what the high status people are doing, whether that's presidents, celebrities, politicians, and they just do what they do. They encourage that narrative, whatever it is. If the president says the sky is red, okay, the sky's red. If the president says the water is dry, okay, yeah, I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the point being that most people are not really thinking for themselves. They're just following the tribe because they want to gain status within the tribe. And, maybe there's some kind of evolutionary psychology reason for this, that maybe thousands of years ago, if you didn't fit in with the tribe, it might have been a death sentence, right? If you're out on your own, you could have, you might easily die because you need to sort of fit in with the tribe. But maybe it's like a piece of biological hardware that hasn't been sort of updated for the modern day realm. And so that, I think, explains why we see a lot of people who just take whatever the narrative is, whether the narrative is about, the COVID stuff or other things. I think that's what it is. And so the way I see it is there's probably 10 to 20% of the population who are capable of actually bucking that trend, or at least questioning and stopping for a second and saying, wait a second, is that actually correct? I want to do what's actually the correct thing instead of just doing what the tribe is doing. And I think it comes back to libertarianism and this idea also, because many people just, they don't really think to question the system that they live under, and they don't think to challenge what people around them are saying, whether if they're coming out with very, statist ideas like, oh, everybody needs to, tax, as an example, they may say something like, quote unquote, taxes are the price we pay to live in a civilized society. Well, no, I actually think states are often decivilizing in nature. We could actually have a more civilized society if we lived in a more in a realm where things were more private. It was private schooling and private roads and private, defense and private law and all of these things. So I think there are a lot of ways in which libertarian ideas are rising in prominence. So, for example, homeschooling. More and more people are looking at homeschooling instead of this idea that the state must educate your children in a way that is kind of like a jail environment almost. Like you're here this period. Okay, the bell is going off. Okay, now you're off to the next period. Okay, now you got a short break out in the yard. Hope you don't get bullied out there, and you better find your clique. Or otherwise, if you don't find your clique, you might again get bullied. And then okay, bell's back to class, back to the jail, and rinse and repeat.
If you have to pee, you have to raise your hand and ask permission.
Exactly.
Everything is
So
permission based.
exactly. And so obviously libertarians, there's an obvious natural crossover here of libertarians who are focused on this idea of, wait a minute, is public schooling actually the right way to do this? Maybe we could have more private forms of schooling. And the issue also with quote unquote private schooling is that much of it is also done in the same statist way, or the statist government regulations impact that in such a way that it takes away the benefit of actually having a truly private system. And that's why I think so many libertarian people are often, homeschoolers, or at least open-minded to the idea of doing homeschooling or some other means of educating their children. So, I mean, that's just one example. I mean, there's so many other examples we could go into, but that's the broad idea, which is that, are you interested in what's correct, or do you want to just go with the tribe even if they're wrong, because you'd rather just be with the tribe even if you're incorrect?
Yeah, I would say I'm even more optimistic than you in terms of how many people can really be awakened by this. And I think that it all comes down to inflation, just being that boot on their head that they can't escape from. They don't have any space to start thinking like a real free person.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's
And
like a, Maslow's hierarchy, right? It's kind of like
yeah,
at the base level, you just need food and water to even survive, and then maybe you need like some creature comforts, and then maybe you need relationships, and maybe a wife or a husband, or and so on. As you go up and up that level, then you start to have the possibility of being focused more on intellectual ideas and actually thinking about these things. And so that's why if you talk to, as an example, I talked to my friend Javier from Venezuela. He's a Bitcoiner, and he talks about how when he tries to talk about some of these ideas to people, they are just literally not at a level that they can even accept the message, because they are just, sadly, that close to starvation or to real struggle that they can't afford to even think about some of these higher ideals.
Yeah,
And so,
because every single
yeah,
one of those levels is under attack when your money is being debased. Rent is getting more expensive, food is getting more expensive, so you have to eat lower quality food, you're less healthy, you have to move into a worse place that might be like moldy and dark and you don't have any windows, and like when you have to downgrade everything around you because your money can't buy what it used to, it just permeates across your entire worldview. And it's no wonder why these people aren't venturing outside of that very clear cut narrative that's being fed to them, whether it be Fox News or MSNBC. They kind of just cling on to that because it gives them a direction, and they're starving for a direction because they don't know what to do.
yeah. And
And
you know what? It's that, and then there's some people who just kind of disengage, right? So you may see that
yeah,
meme. Did you see the game last night, right? Like, so if you're trying to
yeah,
talk about some serious thing, but
guy at
then
the barbecue.
they're sort of focused on the bread and circuses, right? They're focused on
Yes.
kind of this sideshow, or getting caught up in very big debates about, the controversy of the day, whether it's some drama, it's a he said she said, or some reality TV star said this, or some celebrity did that. Oh my god, did you hear what this rock star did? Like, that's kind of, people are getting caught up in these things, or in sports, or whatever, or
The
other
magazines in
distractions.
the checkout line, they're just all celebrities and just giant letters
Right.
and
Yeah. Or some people are checked out with drugs. Some people are, some young males are checked out with, video games or whatever. There's all kinds of ways that people are just kind of checking out of the system. And it's a bad thing for society. It's a bad thing for the world. What we
Mhm.
want is people to really focus on what would be right, and focusing on fixing the money, of course, with Bitcoin, and then trying to undo some of this cultural damage that has been done over generations and generations of abuse, neglect, and so on.
And the people asking probably like, how does libertarianism solve this huge problem? I would say every libertarian I know is focused on getting rid of central banking and eliminating inflation because it's not necessary, and starting from a hard money, which is Bitcoin. And basically every libertarian is either a gold bug or a Bitcoiner that I follow. And that solves the problem from the very top. Like, you have to go for the very top level that's causing all the problems in order to start picking away at it, freeing these people from this prison they're in, a mental prison that's stopping them from being able to think about these things and live a better life and have better relationships, better food, better living situation. All those things add up. And you also talked about, man, there's so many ways we could go here. That's awesome, man. Um, just in terms of the decentralization of governance and like breaking the state down into a more decentralized way, because I know people when they hear like, oh, my Washington might secede or Texas might secede, like the people who the states that are like more on the extreme side of the left right spectrum, I think that like scares people a little bit because it's different, it's a change. It sounds
Well,
scary.
let me make this point. Countries have not, people are born into the world, and maybe they go through the schooling system and they look at the world map and they think it was always that way, but it really wasn't.
Hmm.
Countries
Hmm.
have formed, come together, maybe split off certain chunks. It happens quite often. I mean, even in our lifetimes, places like Czechoslovakia, it used to be. Now it's Czechia and Slovak, the Slovak. And there's also, I think, Norway and Sweden. I think one of them used to be part of another. There are other examples where, you know, the EU is sort of this project where they've tried to push all these European countries together, but it's having a lot of bad side effects now, bad
Hmm.
negative effects. So this notion that just because a country was one at one time this size and this place doesn't mean it must always be that way. Now, yeah, okay, America is 50 states and so on, but you know, I also think it's uh, I think when you really do the research and look into things like secession and how these things work, you can see that it really wasn't this way all the time.
Hmm.
Things did move and shift around as people had different ideas about what they belonged to. So, for example, in Texas, I know there's a lot of people who think of themselves as Texans before they think of themselves as Americans,
Right.
and that's not just Texas. I mean, there are other places in the world that even in Italy. the south of Italy and the north of Italy, they don't necessarily like each other,
Yeah.
right? Or in India, India has all these different subgroups. So all around the world, there are many examples of, subgroups that don't necessarily like each other. They've been quote unquote unified because maybe somebody historically had an incentive to do that because for him he wanted to have a big empire, he wanted more power,
Mhm.
or he uh, maybe sold them this narrative of, oh, we're stronger together, we should all be united together under this particular banner of whatever country, whether it's France or Italy or America, whatever. But historically, that it wasn't always that way. People who lived in some particular town did not necessarily feel kinship with somebody who lived thousands of miles away. They weren't necessarily going to go and die in a war to protect this guy who lived thousands of kilometers away. But nowadays, with modern propaganda, with the state and with the schooling, they sort of push you into this system where you sing the national anthem and you look at the flag and you so on and so forth. And that's really part of what's happened around the world. Now, look, are we going to be able to dissolve nation states anytime soon? No, I don't think it may not even happen in my lifetime. But I'm focused on ways that people can at least be aware of this, focus on ways to make the state smaller so that there's more room for you and I and for the individuals to grow their lives, their families, their businesses, their communities. And so I'm focused on that. I think obviously Bitcoin is a huge part. I think it's the number one most important tool here, but also things like free private cities. That's an example where they're trying to go and set up a private city where you sort of opt into a specific agreement. It's like you have a contract that you have a specific agreement about how things would work. And that may allow opportunities for some of these really prosperous places. We could see the next Singapore or Hong Kong or Dubai come from one of these free private city style arrangements. And so that's another area that's interesting. There's all kinds of areas and angles that libertarians are pushing. In America, there is the Free State Project. So that's another example over in New Hampshire where a bunch of libertarians are getting together and basically trying to flip the state to become more libertarian, and even if they can't get elected directly themselves, they're having an impact on the local politics by pushing, let's say, the
Mhm.
Republicans to become more liberty friendly. So these are some of the ways that people can have an impact, and it's happening all around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of my experiences that's really pushed me more toward this is my hometown is very small little town, and the differences I see between that and a city, because I've lived in some cities as well, is to me that's really painted a picture for the benefits you get from having a smaller community of specific rules that are really catered to that area. For example, um, so it's on the water, right? There are some rules. You can't go and like murder the whales in the cove. We have whales that come in. Like you can't, kill the whales. You can't dump your waste into the water. We care about keeping nature good. And speaking of nature, people have built these little trails all over the place in the woods. It just happens naturally. There's no rules against that. And there's little pieces of art everywhere. There's art installations everywhere you go. And people are more open to these sorts of ideas because everything isn't like super hard rules everywhere and passed down from a federal government that doesn't know you. Different communities have different wants and needs. Like other ones will, think like, oh, we don't really want art everywhere. Like we want to keep things like completely clean. We want to be like Singapore where everything is like sparkling everywhere. And that'd be great for certain places. And once you have a free market of regions where people can live, people can decide which community they really fit into. And it's not
Exactly.
so much
Yeah.
of this national blob where everything is trying to be forced into a single box. You can find which place you vibe with. And that
Exactly.
really
Yeah.
works in the modern age where so many people are working remotely anyway. I've been very nomadic the last few years, so I've been able to sort of go where my heart's taken me, and it's been awesome to just see these different places and see how people are different everywhere. Um, so I think that's really exciting stuff. Just the fact that more people are thinking that way, and it, and I think that most of people's fear about this comes from the idea that it would just be chaos if we don't have this safety net, and the sort of socialistic ideas, because this was sort of where I came from, several years ago before I started falling into the Bitcoin rabbit hole, was that I used to think a little dash of socialism is okay, just for like the really important stuff, like we want to have a safety net for the very misfortunate out there. Like I don't want the people who have, very bad mental illness or disease to just be left on the street because they can't work. Like I'm happy to pay a little bit of taxes to, make sure those people have some health care. So, what do you say to people who use that as their argument for having
Right.
some government?
Sure. So, I mean, firstly, you do have to look at how governments have done solving this problem. In many cases, they've made it worse. They have, in name, said, yeah, we're going to fix these problems, but they haven't. And if you look at San Francisco, if you look at, some of these other liberal cities, that's unfortunately that's what's happened, where there are people, drug users, just on the streets, and just really unsafe, unclean environments. So the libertarian answer to some of these ideas is that, first of all, the cost of living would be far, far lower than it is today. We are living in a society where you could make an argument, depending on inflation rates, that people in some ways are even poorer than they were decades ago. You now need two incomes to provide what used to be one income. And so we're seeing all this pressure and all this brought on because people are paying such high tax levels to the state. Imagine if we were living in a world where the tax is a lot lower, the goods could be a lot cheaper, people could survive, and people could look after their own families and look after themselves much more easily because the cost of living would be so much cheaper. That's step one. The other aspect, historically, there used to be this thing called mutual aid societies. There's a great book by David T. Beto. It's called From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State. And so he talks about in that book, pre the government welfare state, there used to be this mutual aid societies and beneficial societies. People would voluntarily join these things, and they would voluntarily pay a membership fee, and that membership fee would help look after those who are less fortunate. And guess what else?
Sort of like a local
Because
taxation, right?
yeah, kind of, but like an opt-in thing. And people
Yeah,
would join
your
these, and
choice.
people would join them by choice. And sometimes it was based on like a racial, group that they came from. Maybe they were all from a particular country, or maybe it was a religious thing, right? Historically, probably religious rates were higher. And so that was what used to be. And here's the other important factor. In a mutual aid society, or these kind of mutual aid and beneficial societies context, if you are an asshole, you won't get paid. Like you won't, you're not just going to like. So there's a pro-civilizing, socializing nature to these. Contrast that with the welfare state. You can be a complete asshole, and the state will just give you this money and their food stamp voucher, EBT, whatever. So you can just look at the different incentive in those two different systems. That's, just an obvious, clear example. Also, the free market was bringing a lot of people out of poverty. It was actually, I think it was around the 60s or 70s when the welfare statism in the US came up a lot, and poverty rates started to stall out there. It didn't, the poverty rates were already on the down. So in many cases, what happens is there was a pre-existing trend of the free market actually going to fix these things, but then the government sort of jumps in, tries to take the credit for it, and then sort of screws it up and often sends it the opposite direction. And so that has been the reality. And if you look at, people have this idea because they treat the state like this little comforting blanket that they can put over themselves. But the reality of the last 3 or 4 years has shown us all that that was a massive lie. That
Totally.
the state did not make people more safe, and in many cases exacerbated the harmed young children, harmed the developing world, because children were shut out from going to schools. Young children were having their developmental issues because they were being forced to wear masks or not talk to adults and see the facial expression of that adult, with because the adult's wearing a mask as well. And they weren't going to school. They were doing this kind of Zoom school garbage. And then you think about the developing world, and think about those countries who are dependent on tourism, who are destitute or massively struggling now economically because of all the shutdowns, lockdowns, mandates, and all of this. So I think this notion that there is comfort in having a nation state, really, if you step back and look at the last few years, that should have taught you something. And so if you're in that, let's say, smaller group of people who can think open-mindedly for yourself, I think you have to step back and say, well, no, it's not clear to me that the nation state made any of this better. And really, I would argue it made it much worse.
And these are only the very recent examples that should be bringing up questions. Like, not to mention the IMF and the World Bank on the topic of all these third world countries and how they're struggling so much right now. I'll throw that in the show notes. I'm sure you've read Alex Gladstein's work. He talks about this.
Yeah.
Like, we're using that money printer to basically just burden every country with massive debt just because we can, and we can just extract their resources and basically make them our slave on the world stage. And that's going on all the time. So the fact that so many countries in the world are struggling right now really is the fault of America in a lot of ways. And this is why I think it's so crazy that Americans don't really understand this at all. It's all happening behind the scenes. It's a major problem. And something you mentioned there was, or I guess we've been mentioning this throughout, is just this idea of a free market being a good thing. And a lot of people have a very misconstrued idea of capitalism. And I think this would be a great one to clear up, because I think that the prevailing narrative is that capitalism is bad because unfettered capitalism, they say, like when people are left completely to be free, people just consume, we take up space, we become consumeristic, and all these problems come from that, and we're just like an unsustainable organism that doesn't know where to stop. So how would you describe capitalism, and how would you maybe critique that view?
Sure. Yeah. So capitalism to me just means private ownership of the means of production. That's fundamentally what it is, right? We think about capital goods or productive goods and having those be privately owned, as opposed to socialism, which is socialized ownership of the means of production, right? It doesn't just mean, like, that's the technical dictionary definition of socialism and capitalism. And so really, capitalism is the process of civilization. It is actually how we create wealth and we rise up from, let's say, that there's lower level of Maslow's hierarchy needs, right? Just the basic, instead of living in the cave and living under the trees, we can live in houses and have running water and electricity and internet. It's because of capital and capitalism that we can even have these things. So some of the critiques come, and there's many critiques that people put up against the free market. In many cases, they say things like, oh, market power, or, oh, there's a monopolist, or, oh, there's an oligopoly, and therefore we need some kind of government regulating agency to come in and break up the monopoly, break up this company, or to
Yeah.
stop antitrust is a typical one. But even here, they basically draw this sort of cartoon version of what they think a market should look like. And they have often, it's like a Chicago school style, perfectly competitive idea. So they sort of draw on a whiteboard what they think the real world should look like. And then they critique the real world for not looking like that whiteboard drawing. It's absolutely crazy. And in many
Perfectly
cases,
competitive sounds like an oxymoron. Like, competition is inherently messy. Like, you have to,
and it's a process,
Yeah.
and it may well be that, certain industries tend to having a few large dominating players. But so long as you have a free choice in who you can patronize and be a customer of, it's okay. And here's the other biggest contradiction that they never talk about, which is that you should have a monopoly of government, of law and order. We should have antitrust laws for the state. Why are these people not being consistent, right? They
Perfect.
think of it like, oh, look, you have a monopoly, and they might look at, okay, I'll give an Australian example. They say, oh, look, Coles and Woolworths are the big two supermarkets, like food and grocery stores. Oh, we need to regulate them because they're having too much market power and they're going to, whatever. But they don't realize that they themselves are the government and having a monopoly, literally a monopoly power on law and taxation and all of these things. So it's just fundamentally a flawed approach. It's economically a flawed approach. And in many cases, they simply assume that they will be this sort of enlightened ones who will not do things in an abusive way. when in real practicality, what we've seen around the world is government regulatory agencies getting captured by the actual companies that they're meant to be regulating. And so there's this sort of
Yes.
what's the word? Like a revolving door of
Hmm.
people who go work at the regulator and then go work at one of these big companies later. And so sometimes maybe it's like a little bit of a buddy situation of oh, hey, I'm in the regulator and you're in the big company. And let me give you a favor by giving you some kind of favorable regulation for you. And you won't compensate me now, but later, once I quit my job at the regulator, oh, guess what? You'll give me a nice, cushy job in your company where I earn all this money for basically doing nothing. Or maybe it's like
Consulting.
I get nice consulting
Or
fees, or I
speaking
get
fees, like
speaking
Janet Yellen
fees.
does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, like speaking fees, like the Janet Yellen or Hillary Clinton and some of these other people. They just get these
Hmm.
crazy speaking fees, like literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not that they have some great insight that we need to all go and sit down and listen to their great insights for their speaking fee. No, it's just a scam, and
Yeah.
people are not willing to call it out. That's the simple reality of it. And so, sadly, people look at headlines. People don't really read the economics of it. So they don't go and read Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises and some of these people who've written about some of these issues, about the problems of government as a monopoly, or Hans Hermann Hoppe, right? So on further analysis, it all crumbles down. That's the short answer, right? That they say this kind of idea, but it's very fundamentally flawed when you really stop and think about it.
And anyone who's watched The Big Short, I would say, has an idea of the banking system being the poster boy of this corruption, of this revolving door you're talking about, where the regulators and the bankers and the government entities, they're literally sleeping with each other
Yeah,
and have these huge problems. But what people most of the time don't know is that this is happening across all the major corporate industries. Like, one example that I've become familiar with as being totally part of this is the airline industry, because I do a lot of flying, you do a lot of flying, and I think we didn't even talk about this before, but I think we can agree that it's a terrible time these days. It's just getting worse and worse because the bailouts are always happening. And the biggest example was during COVID, they bailed out all these airlines who were
yeah,
struggling. They basically just infused them with a bunch of money. The CEOs pocketed a bunch of cash. They did a bunch of stock buybacks. And this is essentially just part of just incentivizing these big industries to not improve, not change, not clean up their balance sheet. They can do whatever they want because they have the magic money printer will save them anytime. And this is what really creates these insane monopolies, because I wouldn't say that, maybe you can speak on this, but I wouldn't say libertarians think that monopolies are a good thing. They just think that there is a free market. When the free market is unleashed, they won't happen because they will actually fail when they get too big and start doing crazy things. They actually get wrecked.
yeah.
And then
And in fact,
new
let me
new
make a
ones will bloom
yeah,
from the ashes.
yeah, and let me make a quick point here, because the actual natural monopoly is the state. Right? That's the only monopoly. All the other, basically, the only monopolies that exist are the cases where the state either is that monopoly or has given a special privilege for some company to be a monopoly. In every other case, there has been competition. It just depends on how you define that competition. And so the reality of it is free market competition actually works. It actually brings prices down and quality up. But unfortunately, a lot of people have these very statist ideas, and that's why we don't live in a real free market today. But we could bring it back, or at least move in that direction. Even if we're not going to get to the theoretically perfect, fully free market, we can at least step in that direction.
And in the theme of people thinking that capitalism is this bad word and it's not a good thing, would you say that the USA is capitalist right now?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, yeah, it's a mixed system. Okay, so you can look at some of these like freedom indexes as an example. So there's heritage.org. I think they have an economic freedom index. Some of these freedom indexes will try to do things based on like taxes, regulations, etc. But I mean, the actual harsh reality is the America's position on some of these freedom indexes has been dropping a lot in recent decades. When I was born, it was probably one of the more free countries, ish. But over the years, it's really come down a lot, and so it's a strange thing to think about. especially for Americans who may be listening. They may be thinking, "What? Oh, I thought we were the country of the free market, and we're sort of known for being that." Obviously, America still has a very entrepreneurial culture, depending on where you go. But the actual reality is, yes, it's becoming less of a free market over time. Sadly, more and more taxes, more and more regulations. It is things like tariffs, and all these rules are harming the business environment.
I would say I align with what Robert Breedlove says. He says that if you have a central bank controlling the money, it's not capitalism, period. Like, I just think it's
Ultimately,
more
we aren't
communist
free.
than
Yeah,
capitalist.
I mean, ultimately, we are not free until we get a free market money, sound money. Sound money means money chosen by the market, and money, secondarily, money not controlled by the government. And
Yep.
so I think over time, Bitcoin will monetize, and Bitcoin is literally the only pathway to liberty. So, there are a lot of libertarians who aren't really into Bitcoin, or maybe they did some mining in 2011 and they lost the coins or whatever, but they're not really into it now. Well, no, it's now time to wake up, start auto stacking Bitcoin, get whether you are earning Bitcoin, mining Bitcoin, or auto stacking with Swan. I don't care. The main thing is that you should be stacking Bitcoin because it is literally the only pathway to liberty. Because if somebody else can print the money that you use, you're just their slave. They will just keep printing and you will just keep working. And think about it like this. We spend hours and hours to earn money. It's not necessarily easy to make money today. But if somebody else can just print your money, you are their slave. They will just manipulate the system to benefit them and harm you. So literally, Bitcoin is the only pathway to liberty.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And if someone else can print the money that you work for, then I think by definition you're a slave. And by implementing a Bitcoin standard, that will give us the first real anarcho-capitalist experiment to see if it works. And all the research we've been doing, the history we've looked at, the books we've read show that that's going to be a beautiful thing for everybody. So I think it's a really exciting time to be alive, to be part of this revolution and watch it all happen in real time. Really appreciate your time, man. I think that we're probably hitting a good time to wrap things up here because I know it's
Great.
late where you are. So if we could just wrap it up here, what would you say is your main message that you just want to spread far and wide to the world?
I think people should stack Bitcoin, accumulate Bitcoin for the long haul. Now, it's not a get rich quick scheme, to be clear. It is a long term hodling and saving technology. Think of it like a savings technology that you can save in a system outside the state's control of money. That to me is the number one thing. I think if we can grow that number of people who are using Bitcoin, of course, saving with it, and of course, if you want to spend it, you can, but ultimately, growing that base of people who are Bitcoin users, believers, hodlers, stackers, that to me is the most important thing. Because if we grow that, all of these other downstream things will improve. We will see a world that is more free. We'll see a world where people can actually make choices in a competitive environment because there will be different nation states and you can choose the ones that give you a better deal instead of just being stuck where you were born or where you grew up. It doesn't have to be like that. We could actually create a better world, and it's not just about it's not a zero-sum game in my view. I think Bitcoin is a positive-sum game. As more and more people join this system and join the network, we all benefit from that. And so I think that's the way people should go. I understand there are other libertarians with different priorities, but to me, Bitcoin is the number one priority. So I think it is the number one thing that anyone interested in liberty should be doing. This is the path to liberty.
And I think that everyone would agree that whether it's yellow rocks or Bitcoin, fixing the money is what fixes the world. That's why we yell that from the rooftops. Fix the money, fix the world. It is the foundation of teamwork in society, and it's how people use the value that they create and earn from it. It's how people fall into areas that they specialize in. They can do what they want to do, monetize that, and be able to live their life the way that they want to. And that's why money is so important, even for people like myself who weren't finance nerds by any means just a few years ago. But as we learn more and more about how important this is, it becomes all encompassing. We get obsessed with it because it's Bitcoin isn't just about money. It's about fixing the incentive structure around society so people can be more free, do what they want to do, live better lives. And it really all comes down to getting rid of the fiat money printer. And that's why I'm wearing my favorite shirt today. Shout out to Lena. Got my money printer shirt on. I think that
Cool,
this is a
cool.
meme that needs to be spread far and wide. People need to learn that this is the problem and it's fixable. It's completely fixable. The transition out of the current system is not going to be pretty, most likely. It's going to be messy. And that's why I started this podcast, why you have your podcast, I assume, so we can just get this message out, bring more people into this fold of thinking about things differently. And man, it's an exciting time, and I appreciate you very much. Your podcast has been huge for my own journey, and I'll make sure to put that in the show notes. I want everyone to go start at episode 1 of the Stephan Livera podcast. It's a fantastic resource for libertarian thinking, Austrian economics, and the Bitcoin revolution. So, Stephan Livera, appreciate you so much for coming on, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben.